The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, cream-colored and expensive, the kind used for wedding invitations or funeral announcements. And Margot Brennan held it in her hands for 3 full minutes before opening it because some part of her already knew it would change everything. Inside was a single photograph, old and faded, showing her father's study from an angle she'd never seen before. And tucked behind the heavy curtains in the corner was the edge of something small and mechanical. A camera, perhaps, or recorder. And beneath the photo, someone had written in careful block letters, "Your sister knows what he did." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the photograph was unmistakably from Ashwood Manor, the family estate where Margot had grown up in what everyone called a storybook childhood. The kind written about in Sunday supplements and society pages. All garden parties and charitable. Foundations and her father, Callum Brennan's. Face smiling from the business section as one of the state's most respected defense attorneys. Margot's hands began to shake and she sat down hard on her apartment floor, the photograph slipping from her fingers and landing face up on the hardwood where it seemed to stare at her accusingly. She had 2 sisters, Deirdre, older by 4 years and living in Sacramento with a husband and 3 children she barely mentioned, and Sowers, younger by 6 years and currently residing in a psychiatric facility in Northern California where she'd been on and off for the past decade. Ever since her first suicide attempt at 17, the family didn't talk about Sowers much. Not in the way they talked about Margot's law degree from Stanford or Deirdre's marriage to a tech executive. And when they did mention her, it was always with the same careful tone people use around broken things, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile piece she'd managed to construct in her medicated existence. Margot picked up the photograph again and looked closer at that corner, at the hidden camera or recorder or whatever it was, and felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest like a blade made of ice. She thought about Sowers at 17, beautiful and brilliant and suddenly silent. The way she'd stopped playing piano and stopped laughing and stopped being herself. How she'd locked herself in the bathroom with a bottle of their mother's pills, and how their father had been the one to find her, to call the ambulance, to hold her mother Fianuala while she wept in the hospital waiting room. Everyone had said how lucky they were that Callum had come home early that day, how he'd saved Sowers' life, what a hero he was, what a devoted father. Margot remembered believing that too, remembered standing at his side during the crisis, being his good daughter, his reliable one, the one who kept it together while everyone else fell apart. The second envelope arrived 3 days later, this one containing a thumb drive and a note that read, "Listen to track 7, April 2009. Margot held the thumb drive like it might explode, her mind racing through April 2009, when she'd been 24 and finishing her first year at Stanford Law, when Sowers had been 16 and still at home, still playing piano, still smiling, still months away from the bathroom and the pills and the long silence that followed. She plugged the drive into her laptop with trembling fingers and saw it contained dozens of audio files, all labeled with dates spanning from 2007 to 2010, all numbered and organized with the kind of meticulous care that made her stomach turn dot track. 7 from April 2009 was 18 minutes long, and Margot almost didn't press play, almost threw the whole thing away, almost convinced herself this was some kind of sick prank or mistake or misunderstanding. But she thought about Sowers in that facility, about the way her younger sister flinched when anyone touched her unexpectedly, about the nightmares she still had that made her scream in her sleep, about the way she'd once whispered to Margot during a visit that she wished she'd succeeded in the bathroom that day, that living was harder than dying would have been. Margot put in her headphones, closed her eyes, and pressed play. The recording started with the sound of a door closing, footsteps on hardwood. Then her father's voice saying something she couldn't quite make out, followed by Sours's voice, younger and lighter than Margot remembered, saying she needed help with her history paper. Margot's breath caught because she could hear it now. The innocence in her sister's tone, the trust, and then her father's voice getting closer to the microphone, saying of course he'd help. He always had time for his little star, his talented girl. What followed made Margot rip the headphones out of her ears and run to the bathroom, where she vomited until there was nothing left, until she was dry heaving and sobbing and clutching the cold porcelain like it was the only solid thing in the world that had just revealed itself to be built on rot. She couldn't listen to more. Not then, not yet. But she knew with horrible certainty that there were dozens more files, dozens more times, dozens more moments when her father had violated her sister in that study with its leather furniture and law books and awards for excellence in jurisprudence and service to the community. Margot sat on her bathroom floor for 2 hours, her mind trying and failing to reconcile the father she knew with the voice on that recording, the man who taught her to ride a bike and paid for her education and celebrated every achievement, with the monster who'd done those things to Sours, who'd been doing them for years apparently, who'd recorded them like trophies or insurance or evidence of his own depravity. When she could finally stand, Margot called Deirdre and asked if they could meet. Said it was important, said it was about Sours. Deirdre agreed to coffee the next morning at a place halfway between their apartments, and Margot spent the night sitting at her kitchen table with the thumb drive in front of her, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything else, her mind circling around one terrible question. Did anyone else know? Their mother had to have known something, had to have seen signs, had to have wondered why Sours changed so dramatically, why she tried to kill herself, why she could barely function around their father afterward. And Deirdre, who'd been in college during those years but came home for holidays and summers, had she noticed anything, suspected anything, chosen to look away? Deirdre arrived at the coffee shop in her usual armor of expensive athleisure and minimal makeup, looking like every other wealthy mother in the Bay Area, her highlighted hair pulled back in a ponytail and her wedding ring catching the light as she reached for her latte. She smiled at Margot with the careful distance she'd maintained for years, the same distance she maintained with everything and everyone except her children, as if she'd decided early that the safest way to live was to keep the world at arm's length. Margot didn't waste time with small talk, just slid the photograph across the table and watched Deirdre's face go white. Watched her sister's hand shake as she picked it up and stared at that corner, at that hidden camera. Deirdre set the photo down carefully, too carefully, and said in a voice like broken glass that she didn't know what Margot was trying to say. Margot wanted to scream, wanted to grab her sister and shake her and make her acknowledge what they both knew now. But instead, she kept her voice steady and said there were recordings, that someone had sent them, that they proved what their father had done to Sours. Deirdre's face did something complicated, a series of micro-expressions that Margot couldn't quite read. Grief and fear, and something that might have been relief, or might have been resignation. And then she said very quietly that she'd always wondered, that she'd seen things when she still lived at home, before Margot was born. Things she'd tried to forget. The coffee shop seemed to tilt sideways, and Margot gripped the edge of the table, her mind refusing to process what Deirdre was implying, what she was saying without quite saying it. Deirdre wouldn't meet her eyes now, was staring at her latte like it contained answers or escape. And Margot heard herself ask in someone else's voice if their father had hurt Deirdre too. Her older sister's silence was answer enough, stretched out between them like a chasm. And when Deirdre finally spoke, she said she'd spent 20 years in therapy trying to forget. trying to build a life where it didn't matter, trying to protect her own daughters by never leaving them alone with their grandfather, by always having an excuse for why they couldn't visit Ashwood Manor, by keeping them safe in the only way she knew how, which was distance and vigilance and silence. Margot felt something crack open inside her. Some foundation she'd built her entire identity on, the good daughter, the successful one, the one who'd escaped the family drama and made something of herself. She asked Deirdre why she'd never said anything, never told anyone, never stopped him from doing it to Sowers, and Deirdre flinched like she'd been slapped. Her sister's voice was barely a whisper when she said she'd tried to tell their mother once, when she was 14. And Fianuala had gotten very quiet and very pale, and then said that Deirdre must have misunderstood, that their father would never do such a thing, that speaking such lies could destroy the family, destroy everything. And wasn't Deirdre grateful for everything she had? For this beautiful house and good schools and opportunities that other girls would kill for? The betrayal of it hit Margot like a physical blow. The realization that their mother had known, had chosen their father over her own daughter, had sacrificed Deirdre and later Sowers to protect the family's reputation and her own comfortable life. Deirdre was crying now, silent tears running down her face while she kept her voice steady and said she'd moved out as soon as she could, had gone to college across the country, had built walls around herself so high that nothing could get in. Not even the memories, not even the guilt. She said when Sowers was born, she'd hoped things would be different, that maybe their father had changed, that maybe it had only been her. But then she'd seen the same signs, the same changes, the same slow destruction of a bright young girl. And she'd done nothing because what could she do? Who would believe her, and part of her, the worst part, had been relieved that at least now she wasn't the only one, wasn't alone, her ruined childhood. Margot wanted to hate Deirdre for the cowardice and the silence, but all she felt was a terrible, aching grief for all three of them, for the sisters they might have been if their father hadn't stolen their childhoods, if their mother hadn't chosen complicity over protection. She asked Deirdre if she'd talk to the police, if she'd testify if it came to that, and her sister laughed, a sound like breaking bones, and said Margot had no idea what she was suggesting. Their father was Margot Brennan, defender of the powerful, friend to judges and district attorneys, a man who'd spent 40 years building a fortress of connections and favors and carefully cultivated goodwill, who knew every loophole in the system because he'd spent his career exploiting them for his clients. Going after him wouldn't be justice, it would be war. And Deirdre had 3 daughters to think about, a husband whose tech company couldn't afford the scandal, a life she'd built specifically to be separate from all of this. But Margot was thinking about Sowers in that facility, about the 28-year-old woman who should have been finishing her doctorate in music theory or performing in concert halls or doing anything except sitting in group therapy sessions and taking medications that made her hands shake and her mind fog. She was thinking about all the other girls there might have been, because men like their father didn't stop with their own children, didn't suddenly develop a conscience or sense of decency when there were other vulnerable young people to exploit. She told Deirdre she was going to the police whether her sister helped or not, that she was going to make sure their father paid for what he'd done. That silence had protected him long enough. Deirdre stood up then, gathering her purse and her car keys, her face closed off again like shutters slamming over windows. She said Margot had always been the idealistic one, the one who believed in justice and truth and all those pretty concepts they taught in law school, but the real world didn't work that way, especially not for men like their father. She said if Margot went to the police, she'd deny everything, would say she never told Margot anything, would protect her family the way she should have been protected, even if it meant lying, even if it meant letting their father win again. Then she walked out of the coffee shop, and Margot sat there alone with cold coffee and a photograph and a thumb, dry full of evidence that might not be enough, might never be enough. To bring down a man as powerful and connected as Callum Brennan, Margot spent 3 days researching her options, reading cases about historical sexual abuse and statutes of limitations and the admissibility of recorded evidence. And every path seemed to lead to dead ends or complications. California had eliminated the statute of limitations for some sexual offenses, but not all. And even with recordings, defense attorneys, especially ones as skilled as her father, could argue about chain of custody and authentication and whether the recordings had been obtained legally. She thought about going to the media, but knew her father's reputation would insulate him initially, that people would assume it was a disgruntled family member or money grab or mental illness, especially given Sours's psychiatric history, which their father would absolutely weaponize. Every strategy she considered seemed designed to protect the powerful and silence the vulnerable. And Margot had never felt the injustice of the legal system as keenly as she did now. Facing it from the other side, on the 4th day, she drove to Northern California to visit Sowers, making an appointment through the facility's coordinator and saying nothing about why she needed to see her sister urgently. The drive gave her too much time to think, to remember Sowers before. The talented pianist who'd won competitions and scholarships, who'd laughed easily and dreamed big, who'd been applying to Juilliard and Curtis before everything fell apart. Margot had been so focused on her own life back then, on law school and internships and building her career, that she'd barely noticed her younger sister's deterioration until the suicide attempt forced everyone to pay attention. And even then, she had believed the story their father told, that Sowers was struggling with depression and anxiety, that it was a mental health crisis, that the family needed to rally around her with support and treatment. The facility was nicer than Margot had expected, more like a wellness retreat than a psychiatric hospital, with gardens and art therapy studios and private rooms overlooking the mountains. Their father's money had bought Sowers the best care available, which was another layer of obscenity, that he could destroy her and then pay for the expensive band-aids that kept her barely functional, that let him play the devoted father dealing with a troubled daughter. Sowers was waiting in the visitor's lounge, thinner than Margot remembered and paler, her red hair pulled back in a braid and her green eyes wary. And when she saw Margot, she smiled, but it didn't reach those eyes. Didn't touch the fundamental sadness that seemed to radiate from her like cold. They made small talk for 10 minutes. Sowers asking about Margot's job at the civil rights nonprofit, and Margot asking about her sister's art therapy classes, both of them dancing around the real conversation until Margot couldn't stand it anymore. She pulled out the photograph and slid it across the table and watched Sours's face go absolutely still, frozen like an animal sensing a predator, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sowers picked up the photograph with hands that shook so badly Margot thought she might drop it. And she stared at that corner, at that hidden camera, and whispered that she'd always suspected he was recording it, that sometimes she'd seen the little red lights blinking in the dark, that he'd told her the recordings were to keep her safe, to make sure she never forgot who she belonged to. Who had the power? Margot started to cry and couldn't stop. Couldn't maintain the professional composure she'd been trying to project. And Sowers set down the photograph and reached across the table to take her hand. Her younger sister's touch was gentle and sad and knowing, and she said it was okay, that she'd known Margot would find out eventually, that the truth had a way of surfacing no matter how deep you buried it. Margot asked who had sent the photograph and recordings, and Sours's smile turned bitter, said she had. that she'd hired a private investigator 2 years ago to break into Ashwood Manor when their parents were traveling, to find the recordings she knew existed, to steal them and copy them and send them somewhere safe until she was ready to use them. The revelation hit Margot like electricity. The realization that her broken sister wasn't broken at all, or not in the way everyone thought. That beneath the medications and therapy and apparent fragility was someone who'd been planning and preparing and waiting for the right moment. Sowers said she'd been collecting evidence for years, ever since she was strong enough to think about something other than survival. Gathering bank statements that showed their father's donations to the facility that kept her institutionalized, emails between him and her doctors discussing her treatment, legal documents he'd had her sign when she was too medicated to understand what they said. All the pieces of the cage he'd built around her to keep her silent and controlled. And dependent Margot asked why now? Why send me evidence now after all these years? And Sowers's face went hard in a way Margot had never seen. Her younger sister suddenly looking older and fiercer and utterly done with pretending. She said their father was planning to run for state attorney general, that he'd already started his campaign, that he was positioning himself as a champion of victims' rights and criminal justice reform, and the hypocrisy of it made her want to burn the world down. She said she'd watched him for years getting away with it, being celebrated and honored and respected, and she'd told herself she could live with that if it meant staying safe and small and medicated. But she couldn't watch him use his crimes as a stepping stone to more power. Couldn't let him become the state's chief law enforcement officer while she rotted in this expensive prison he'd built for her. The plan Sowers laid out was meticulous and ruthless and brilliant. The product of years of thinking and planning and preparing for this moment. She'd already contacted a journalist, a woman named Petra Kowalski, who'd made her career exposing powerful men who'd escaped accountability, sending her copies of some of the recordings and documentation along with an anonymous note promising more. She'd set up offshore accounts to fund her own legal defense and living expenses for when she left the facility, because she wasn't stupid enough to think their father would keep paying for her care once she went public. She'd even researched which prosecutors in the state attorney's office might be willing to take the case despite the political pressure not to, who had reputations for integrity and independence and a willingness to go after powerful defendants. What Sowers needed from Margot was corroboration, another voice saying their father was capable of this, someone whose professional reputation and stability would counter the narrative. He'd spin about a mentally ill daughter making false accusations. She needed Margot to be willing to testify about what was on those recordings, to stand up in court or in front of cameras and say she'd heard them, believed them, supported her sister. She needed Margot to risk everything, her relationship with their parents, her standing in the legal community where their father was well known and respected, possibly her career if the blowback was bad enough, and she was asking, not demanding, saying she'd understand if Margot couldn't do it. If the cost was too high, Margot thought about Deirdre's refusal to help, about her older sister's determination to protect her own family at the expense of justice, and she understood the impulse, understood the fear and the pragmatism and the desire to keep the poison contained rather than letting it spread to the next generation. But she also thought about who she was, the lawyer who'd chosen civil rights work over corporate money, who'd built her career on fighting for people the system had failed, who'd spent years arguing that justice mattered more than convenience or comfort or keeping the peace. She told Sowers she was in, but she'd do whatever was needed, that their father had gotten away with it long enough. They spent the next 3 hours going through Sowers's evidence, and the scope of it was staggering. The recordings dated back to when Sowers was 13, dozens of them, escalating in severity and frequency. a documented pattern of abuse that would be nearly impossible to dismiss or explain away. There were also videos because, of course, their father had upgraded his surveillance as technology improved. And Margot couldn't watch those, couldn't see her sister's young face and the fear in it, couldn't hear her saying no and please stop and daddy please, couldn't witness the systematic destruction of a child's trust and innocence and safety. Sowers said she'd only watched them once, years ago when she first retrieved them, and had never been able to again. But she knew they existed, and that was enough. That was the nuclear option if the recordings alone didn't convince people. Beyond the abuse itself, Sowers had documented the cover-up, the way their father had used his connections to control the narrative after her suicide attempt. There were emails to the hospital's legal department subtly threatening litigation if they didn't maintain patient confidentiality about certain details. Correspondence with the facility where she'd ended up discussing how to frame her diagnosis in ways that would make her seem unreliable as a witness. Payments to a reputation management firm to scrub certain search results about the Brennan family from the internet. Their father had been planning for the possibility of exposure for years, building layers of protection and plausible deniability, and the calculation of it was almost more chilling than the abuse itself. The cold strategic thinking of a predator protecting his hunting grounds. Margot asked about their mother, whether Sowers thought she'd known, and her sister's laugh was bitter and tired. She said, of course, Fianuala had known, that mothers always knew on some level, that all the signs were there if she'd wanted to see them. Sowers remembered trying to tell her once when she was 14, saying that Daddy's special study time made her uncomfortable and she didn't want to do it anymore. And their mother had gotten very stern and said that time with their father was a privilege, that he was a busy, important man who chose to spend time with his daughters, that Sowers should be grateful and obedient and not make trouble. The message had been clear: don't tell. Don't fight, don't ruin everything, and Sowers had learned it well. Had stayed silent for years until the silence became too heavy to carry, and she tried to end it the only way that seemed possible. As Margot drove back home that evening, her mind was racing with strategy and logistics and the sheer enormity of what they were about to attempt. Taking down someone like their father would require perfect timing and overwhelming evidence and a willingness to endure whatever he threw at them in response, because he wouldn't go quietly, wouldn't accept accountability or punishment, would fight with every weapon in his considerable arsenal. She thought about calling Deirdre again, trying once more to get her sister to help, but she knew it was futile, that Deirdre had made her choice years ago and wasn't going to change now. So it would be Margot and Sowers against their father and the entire system that had enabled him. Two damaged daughters against a titan of the legal world. And the odds were terrible, but not impossible. Not if they were smart and careful and absolutely committed. The first phase of Sowers' plan activated 2 weeks later when Petra Kowalski published her initial article in a major online publication. A carefully worded piece that didn't name their father directly, but made it clear she was investigating allegations of sexual abuse by a prominent California attorney with political ambitions. The article included enough details, references to recordings and documented evidence, and multiple alleged victims, to make it clear this wasn't a baseless smear, but a serious investigation. The response was immediate and predictable. Their father's campaign issued a statement calling it a politically motivated hit job. Various colleagues and friends rushed to defend his character. And the conservative media outlets he'd cultivated relationships with started running counter-narratives about the danger of false accusations and trial by. Margot watched it all unfold from her apartment, monitoring news sites and social media and legal blogs, seeing the battle lines being drawn. She'd warned her boss at the nonprofit that she might need time off soon for family issues, not explaining exactly what that meant, and had started organizing her own life for the coming storm. She moved important documents to a safe deposit box, changed her passwords, and enabled two-factor authentication on everything, and consulted with a lawyer friend about what kind of legal threats she might face and how to protect herself. Sowers had warned her that their father would come after them hard, would use every dirty trick he knew, and Margot was determined not to be caught unprepared. The first attack came from an unexpected direction. Margot's apartment building manager called to say there had been complaints about noise and disturbances from her unit, that multiple neighbors had reported concerns, that he needed to discuss her lease. Margot knew immediately it was fabricated, that she'd barely been home the last 2 weeks and certainly hadn't been disturbing anyone. But when she went to the management office, she found formal written complaints on file, signed and dated, alleging everything from loud parties to suspected drug activity. The manager was apologetic but firm, saying he had to take complaints seriously, that there would need to be an investigation, that her lease might be in jeopardy. Depending on what they found out, it was a masterclass in the kind of pressure their father could apply, using his connections and money to make Margot's life difficult in ways that were technically legal but clearly meant to intimidate and distract. Over the next week, she got calls from the IRS saying her tax returns from 3 years ago were being audited, from her car insurance company saying her rates were being raised due to reported accidents she'd never had, from her bank saying there were irregularities in her account that needed to be investigated. Each issue was small enough to be plausibly coincidental, but together they formed a pattern of harassment. A message that said, "Back off, or it gets worse." Margot documented everything, kept detailed records of every call and letter and conversation, and refused to be intimidated. She'd expected this, had prepared for it, and she knew it meant they were getting to him, that he was scared enough to lash out. She called Sowers to check in and found her sister energized rather than frightened, said the attacks meant they were on the right path, that powerful men only fought this hard when they knew they were cornered. Petra Kowalski was continuing her investigation, had apparently found other victims willing to talk off the record, and was building toward a second article that would be even more damaging. The second article dropped on a Friday morning and named Margot Brennan directly, included excerpts from Sowers's recordings, heavily redacted but still devastating, and quoted multiple sources describing a pattern of predatory behavior spanning decades. It detailed how he'd used his position and power to target vulnerable young people, how he'd covered his tracks, how he'd weaponized the legal system he was supposed to serve to protect himself. The article went viral within hours, shared and discussed and debated across social media and news platforms. And by Friday afternoon, their father had suspended his campaign for Attorney General and issued a statement, through his lawyers denying all allegations and threatening to sue for defamation. Margot's phone started ringing immediately. Reporters and former colleagues and people she hadn't spoken to in years, all wanting to know if it was true, if she believed the accusations, what she knew. She ignored most of the calls, but released a brief statement through a lawyer saying she supported her sister Sowers and believed the allegations against their father were credible and serious. The statement was carefully worded to avoid potential defamation claims while making her position clear. And the moment it went public, she felt something shift. A line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Her loyalty publicly transferred from the father who'd raised her to the sister he'd destroyed, her mother called that evening. Fianuala's voice shaking with rage or fear or both, demanding to know how Margot could do this to the family, how she could believe such vicious lies, how she could side with Sowers, who everyone knew was mentally unstable and had tried to manipulate people for years. Margot listened to her mother's tirade for 2 minutes before interrupting to say she'd heard the recordings, that she knew what their father had done, that the only lies were the ones Fianuala had been telling herself for decades. Her mother gasped like she'd been struck, and then the line went dead. And Margot knew that relationship was over too. Another casualty of the truth she'd chosen to speak. The legal maneuvering started immediately. Callum's attorneys filing motions and sending cease and desist letters and threatening criminal charges for theft of the recordings, arguing that they'd been obtained illegally and couldn't be used as evidence. Sowers's lawyer, a sharp woman named Imani Davis, who specialized in cases against powerful defendants, countered with arguments about the recordings being evidence of ongoing crimes and therefore not protected by privacy laws. And the battle moved into the courts, where it would be fought with briefs and motions and oral arguments. The district attorney's office announced they were reviewing the matter but made no commitments about prosecution. And everyone knew that political pressure was being applied behind the scenes. That Callum was calling in every favor he'd accumulated over 40 years of being useful to powerful people. Margot threw herself into supporting Sowers's case however she could, using her legal research skills to help Imani build arguments, connecting them with other attorneys who'd fought similar battles, reaching out to advocacy organizations that might provide resources or publicity. She also started quietly investigating whether there were other victims beyond Sowers and Deirdre, women who might have been young associates at her father's firm or interns or family friends' daughters, anyone who'd been in his orbit during the decades he'd been active. It was delicate work because she couldn't be obvious about it. Couldn't risk tipping him off or giving his lawyers ammunition, but she made calls and sent careful emails and slowly built a list of names worth following up on. 3 weeks after Petra's second article, Margot got a call from a number she didn't recognize, and a woman's voice said she'd seen the news about Margot Brennan and needed to talk to someone who would believe her. The woman's name was Rhiannon Torres, and she'd been a summer intern at her father's firm 15 years ago. Had been 19 and ambitious and thrilled to be working for such a respected attorney, right up until he'd asked her to stay late one evening to help with a case, and the help had turned into something else. Something she'd spent years trying to forget and minimize and convince herself hadn't been as bad as it felt. She'd never told anyone because who would believe an intern over Margot Brennan? Because she'd been drinking at the firm happy hour earlier and worried people would say she'd been asking for it? Because she needed the recommendation letter he promised and couldn't afford to make enemies? Margot listened to Rhiannon's story with a familiar, sick feeling in her stomach, hearing echoes of what he'd done to Sowers and manipulation and boundary violations and abuse of power. The same patterns playing out with different victims. She asked if Rhiannon would be willing to talk to Imani or the district attorney or Petra, and the woman hesitated, said she'd built a good life since then, was married with kids, had a career she'd worked hard for, and she was terrified of what coming forward would cost her. Margot understood that fear intimately but pushed gently. Said her testimony could make the difference between their father facing consequences or getting away with it again. And after a long silence, Rhiannon agreed to think about it, to talk to her therapist and her husband and decide if she was strong enough to fight this battle. Over the next month, 3 more women contacted Margot with similar stories, all former employees or interns or young attorneys who'd encountered their father in professional contexts and found themselves subjected to harassment or assault or coercion, all of whom had stayed silent because the cost of speaking seemed higher than the cost of silence. Margot connected each of them with Imani and provided what support she could, knowing that every additional voice made the case stronger, but also knowing that each woman who came forward was taking an enormous risk, exposing herself to scrutiny and victim blaming and potential retaliation. The courage it took humbled her and made her even more determined to see this through, to make sure their suffering wasn't for nothing. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for late autumn, and the weeks leading up to it were brutal. a constant barrage of legal maneuvering and media warfare and personal attacks. Their father's defense team, led by a notorious attorney named Marcus Webb, who specialized in defending powerful men accused of sexual misconduct, filed motions to exclude the recordings and limit testimony and paint. Sowers is a troubled fantasist with a history of mental illness and a grudge against her successful father. They subpoenaed Sowers's medical records and therapy notes, arguing that her psychiatric history was relevant to her credibility. And Imani had to fight to keep the most private and painful details sealed while still allowing enough disclosure to satisfy the judge. Margot attended every hearing and motion argument, sitting in the courtroom gallery and watching her father play the role of wrongly accused victim with the same skill he'd used throughout his career. He looked older than she remembered, grayer and more drawn, but still commanding. Still the kind of man judges and juries instinctively trusted. And she could see how hard it would be to convince people that this respectable attorney was capable of the crimes he was accused of. Marcus Webb was brilliant and ruthless, using every technicality and procedural trick to delay and obstruct and make the prosecution's job as difficult as possible. And there were days when Margot wondered if they'd underestimated what they were up against. If their father's fortress of privilege and power was simply too strong to breach. But Imani was equally skilled and far more motivated, driven by a genuine belief in justice rather than just winning. And she built the case methodically and carefully, anticipating every defense strategy and preparing counters. She brought an expert, witnesses to authenticate the recordings and testify about grooming behaviors and the long-term psychological effects of childhood sexual abuse. She organized the testimony of Sowers and the other victims to create a devastating pattern of evidence, and she made sure the judge understood that this wasn't about a he said, she said credibility contest, but about documented proof of systematic predatory behavior. The preliminary hearing lasted 3 days, and Margot sat through every minute of it, watching Sowers take the stand and describe what their father had done to her in a voice that was steady, despite the tears running down her face. Her sister was extraordinary, refusing to be shaken by Marcus Webb's aggressive cross-examination, staying calm when he tried to paint her as mentally unstable or vengeful or coached by attorneys, meeting every question with simple, truthful answers that no amount of legal maneuvering could undermine. When Webb asked why she'd waited so long to come forward, Sowers looked directly at their father and said she'd been afraid, that he'd taught her from childhood that he was untouchable, that going against him was futile, but that watching him prepare to become Attorney General had finally given her something stronger than fear, which was rage at the injustice of it. Margot watched her father's face during Sowers's testimony and saw something flicker there. Recognition, maybe, or the first crack in his armor of denial. But it passed quickly, and he resumed the expression of wounded dignity his lawyers had no doubt coached him to maintain. When the recordings were played in court, redacted to protect Sowers's privacy but still unmistakably damning, Margot saw several people in the gallery react with visible disgust, saw one of the court officers look at her father with open contempt, and she felt a small flicker of hope that maybe, finally, people would see him for what he really was. The judge, a woman named Sylvia Chun, who had a reputation for being tough but fair, listened to everything with an inscrutable expression, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly letting the evidence speak for itself. When it was Margot's turn to testify, she walked to the stand on shaking legs, but with absolute conviction about what she needed to say. Imani walked her through her credentials and background, establishing her as a credible witness, then asked her to describe what she'd heard on the recordings Sowers had sent her. Margot spoke clearly about the audio files, about her father's voice and Sowers's younger voice, about the unmistakable sounds of abuse and manipulation, and she saw her father's lawyer start to object before apparently thinking better of it. Marcus Webb's cross-examination focused on trying to establish that Margot was biased against her father, but she had something to gain from his downfall, that her testimony was motivated by family dysfunction rather than actual knowledge of crimes, that Margot had spent years in courtrooms and knew how to handle hostile questioning. She looked directly at Marcus Webb and said she had nothing to gain and everything to lose from testifying, that she was estranged from her entire family except Sowers, that her mother had disowned her and her older sister refused to speak to her, that she'd received death threats and harassment and professional damage since supporting the allegations publicly. She said she was testifying because she'd heard evidence of serious crimes and had a moral and legal obligation to tell the truth, because her sister deserved justice and the other victims deserved justice and the community deserved to know what kind of man Callum Brennan really was. Webb tried to shake her, but she wouldn't be shaken, and when she stepped down from the stand, she met her father's eyes for the first time since. The hearing began and saw something there that might have been hatred or might have been fear. The other victims, who'd agreed to testify, were equally powerful, each adding another layer to the pattern Imani was building, each describing how their father had used his position and authority to coerce and abuse them. Rhiannon Torres testified about the night at his law firm, her voice breaking but her facts unwavering, describing how he'd locked the door to his office and told her that ambitious young women needed to understand how power really worked. A woman named Brenna. Kelly talked about being a college student who'd sought his mentorship and found herself subjected to increasingly inappropriate attention that culminated in an assault at a legal conference. How she tried to report it through proper channels and been told she was making a serious accusation against a respected attorney, and was she sure she wanted to ruin her own career before it started. Each story was different in details, but identical in pattern. The same predatory behavior repeated over and over with victims he'd selected for their vulnerability and lack of power. The defense tried to discredit each witness, suggested they were coordinating their stories or seeking publicity or motivated by money. But Imani had prepared them well, and their testimony held. The recordings were the strongest evidence, but the corroborating witnesses made it impossible to dismiss this as a single disturbed daughter making false accusations. And by the end of the third day, even Marcus Webb seemed to know they were in trouble. Judge Chun took the matter under advisement and said she'd issue a ruling within 2 weeks on whether there was sufficient evidence to bind Callum Brennan over for trial. And everyone left the courthouse knowing that decision would determine everything, would either validate years of suffering and courage or let a predator walk free on technicalities. Those 2 weeks were agonizing, filled with media speculation and legal analysis, and the entire family holding their breath waiting for the decision. Margot tried to focus on work but couldn't concentrate, found herself constantly checking her phone for news, playing out scenarios in her head where the judge ruled either way. Sowers seemed calmer, said that testifying had been cathartic regardless of the outcome, that speaking her truth publicly after years of being silenced was its own kind of justice. But Margot could see the tension in her sister's shoulders, the way she jumped at unexpected sounds, the fear that they'd come this far only to have the system protect their father one more time. The ruling came on a Thursday morning, and Judge Chun's written decision was scathing, finding that the evidence presented was more than sufficient to establish probable cause that Callum Brennan had committed multiple felonies, including sexual abuse of a minor, sexual assault, and using his position to intimidate witnesses. She ordered him bound over for trial on all charges and denied his request for bail, citing the seriousness of the allegations and his substantial resources that made him a flight risk. The courtroom erupted when the decision was read, reporters rushing to file stories and supporters of both sides reacting with cheers or outrage. And Margot watched two bailiffs approach her father to take him into custody, saw the shock and disbelief on his face as he realized he was actually going to jail. Their father's arrest was national. News within hours, leading every major outlet and trending on social media. The story of a prominent attorney and political candidate being charged with decades of sexual abuse too dramatic and symbolic to ignore. The legal community erupted in debate, some defending their father as a colleague being railroaded by politically motivated accusations, others saying they'd always suspected something was wrong, that there had been whispers and rumors for years that no one had taken seriously enough to investigate. Margot did interviews with Petra Kowalski and a few other journalists she trusted, carefully explaining the evidence and the legal process while avoiding saying anything that could prejudice the eventual trial. The victory felt enormous, but also incomplete because Margot knew the trial itself would be even harder, that Marcus Webb would use every resource and strategy available to create reasonable doubt and paint the victims as liars or opportunists. Their father was being held in county jail pending trial, and Margot tried not to think about what that must be like for him, tried not to feel the complicated grief of watching her father, the man who taught her to read and attended her school plays and been proud of her accomplishments, being treated like the criminal he actually was. Sowers seemed lighter after the ruling, more present and alive than Margot had seen her in years, and she said that knowing he was in a cage instead of her was a kind of poetry, a reversal she'd dreamed about for years. The trial was scheduled for the following spring, and the months between the preliminary hearing and trial were consumed with preparation. Imani and her team building the strongest possible case while Marcus Webb filed motions and gave interviews and did everything possible to shift public opinion back in their father's favor. The media coverage was relentless and often brutal, with cable news panels debating the credibility of the victims and legal experts analyzing every procedural detail, and social media becoming a battlefield where people who knew nothing about the case felt entitled to have loud opinions about it. Margot learned to ignore most of it, to focus on what she could control. But some nights she'd fall down rabbit holes, reading comments and articles and feeling the weight of public scrutiny in ways she'd never experienced before. Deirdre maintained her silence throughout everything, refusing interviews and requests for comment, apparently having decided that staying completely out of it was the safest strategy for protecting her own family. Margot tried not to resent her older sister for the abandonment, but couldn't help feeling bitter about it, about being left to carry this fight with only Sowers, when there should have been three of them standing together against their father. Their mother, Fainuala, gave several interviews defending Callum and attacking both Sowers and Margot, calling them ungrateful daughters who were destroying a good man for attention. And each interview felt like another betrayal, another confirmation that their mother had always chosen him over them, and would continue doing so even when confronted with undeniable evidence. Margot's own life had been completely upended by the case. Her romantic relationships, non-existent because who had time or energy for dating when you were trying to take down your predator father? Her friendships strained by the constant stress and media attention. Her career on hold while she devoted herself to supporting Sowers' case. She'd taken a leave of absence from the nonprofit where she worked, unable to focus on other people's legal problems when her own family was consuming all her resources, and she was living off savings that wouldn't last forever. Sometimes she wondered if Deirdre had been right to stay out of it, if the cost of seeking justice was simply too high. But then she'd talk to Sowers or one of the other victims and remember why this mattered, why some fights were worth having regardless of the personal toll. The prosecution team expanded as the trial approached, the district attorney assigning additional prosecutors to help Imani given the complexity and high-profile nature of the case. There was Kenji Sato, who specialized in sex crimes prosecution and brought expertise in handling traumatized witnesses, and Yael Goldstein, who was brilliant at presenting technical evidence like the authenticated recordings to juries in ways they could understand. Together, they formed a formidable team, working 18-hour days to prepare for every possible defense strategy, to anticipate how Marcus Webb would attack their case and have responses ready. Margot sat in on some of the preparation sessions and was impressed by their thoroughness and their genuine commitment to getting justice for the victims, rather than just winning a high-profile case. Jury selection for the trial took 2 weeks because both sides were fighting over every potential juror, trying to find people who could be fair despite the extensive media coverage, but also people whose backgrounds and biases might lean their direction. Marcus Webb used challenges to exclude anyone who worked in social services or victim advocacy or seemed too sympathetic to the #MeToo movement, while the prosecution challenged anyone who expressed skepticism about historical allegations or seemed overly deferential to authority figures. The final jury was 8 women and 4 men, racially diverse, ranging in age from 25 to 67, a group that Imani said she felt cautiously optimistic about, but that could still go. Either way, depending on how the trial unfolded, the trial itself began on a cold March morning with the courtroom packed with journalists and spectators, and family members of both the defendant and the victims. Margot sat in the gallery next to Sowers, who was pale but composed, both of them knowing that the next several weeks would determine whether their years of suffering and fighting had been worth it. Their father looked diminished in his jail jumpsuit, nothing like the commanding presence he'd projected throughout his career. But Margot knew that was partially strategic, that Marcus Webb was coaching him to appear sympathetic and wronged rather than powerful and intimidating. Their mother sat on the defense side of the courtroom, looking devastated and defiant, occasionally glaring at Margot and Sowers with an expression that seemed to hold them personally, responsible for destroying the family, the prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Imani, and it was masterful, walking the jury through the timeline of abuse and cover-up with clinical precision, while still honoring the humanity of the victims. She explained how Callum Brennan had used his position as a father and attorney to prey on vulnerable young people, how he documented his crimes with recordings because he believed himself untouchable, how he'd used his legal expertise to cover his tracks and intimidate anyone who might expose him. She told the jury they'd hear from victims who'd found the courage to speak despite enormous personal cost, that they'd hear recorded evidence that was undeniable and devastating, that they'd see a pattern of behavior spanning decades that could only lead to one conclusion about guilt. Marcus Webb's opening statement painted a completely different picture, describing Callum Brennan as a devoted father and dedicated public servant being destroyed by false allegations from troubled individuals seeking attention and money. He acknowledged that the recordings existed, but argued they'd been taken out of context, that conversations between a father and daughter about difficult topics had been edited and misrepresented to sound sinister. He suggested that Sowers's mental illness had caused her to construct false memories, and that the other alleged victims had coordinated their stories after seeing media coverage, that this was a modern witch hunt driven by social media outrage rather than actual evidence. It was a skillful performance designed to plant seeds of doubt, and Margot felt sick listening to her father being portrayed as the real victim in all of this. The prosecution's case took 3 weeks to present and was methodical and overwhelming in its accumulation of evidence. They started with Sars's testimony, which was even more powerful at trial than it had been at the preliminary hearing. Her voice clear and steady as she described years of abuse and the sophisticated grooming techniques their father had used to maintain control. Marcus Webb's cross-examination was brutal, trying to paint her psychiatric history as evidence of unreliability, but Sowers had prepared for this and handled every question with grace and strength. When Webb suggested she was making false accusations for attention, Sowers looked at the jury and said she'd spent years trying to disappear and die. That attention was the last thing she wanted. That speaking publicly about the worst things that had ever happened to her was torture she was enduring only because it was the right thing to do. The other victims testified in succession, each adding to the pattern, each describing how Callum had selected them and isolated them and violated them. Rhiannon Torres broke down on the stand but pushed through her testimony, describing the shame she'd carried for 15 years and how seeing him run for attorney general had finally made her angry enough to overcome that shame. Brenna Kelly was defiant in her testimony, directly addressing the jury about how predators rely on victims staying silent, how speaking up always costs women more than it costs the men who hurt them, how she was testifying despite knowing she'd be torn apart in the media because she couldn't let another generation of young women encounter Callum Brennan without warning. Each witness was cross-examined aggressively but held firm, and Margot could see some of the jurors reacting emotionally to the testimony. One woman wiping tears during particularly difficult moments. The forensic evidence was presented by experts who authenticated the recordings and explained the technical details of how they'd been made and stored and retrieved. A digital forensics specialist testified that the files showed no signs of tampering or editing, that they were original recordings created at the dates indicated by the metadata, that attempts to suggest they'd been doctored or taken out of context were not supported by the technical evidence. The jury listened to excerpts from the recordings, heavily redacted but still devastating, and Margot watched her father's face as his own voice filled the courtroom, watched him close his eyes like he couldn't bear to hear what he'd done, though whether from shame or strategy she couldn't tell. Psychologists testified about grooming behaviors and child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, explaining to the jury why victims often don't report abuse immediately, why they might maintain contact with their abusers, why their stories might seem inconsistent or incomplete. This testimony was crucial for countering the defense's narrative about why Sowers had waited years to come forward, why she'd continued living under the same roof as their father for months after the abuse escalated, why she hadn't told anyone at the time. The experts explained that this was completely normal behavior for abuse victims, that the dynamics of power and shame and fear that Callum had deliberately cultivated made silence rational and self-protective, that delayed disclosure was the norm rather than the exception in intrafamilial abuse cases. The prosecution also called witnesses who testified about the cover-up, people who'd worked at the hospital after Sowers' suicide attempt and remembered how Callum had pressured them to keep certain details confidential, administrators from the psychiatric facility who'd received unusual instructions about Sowers' treatment and diagnosis from her father's attorneys. A reputation management consultant testified about being hired by Callum to scrub internet search results related to family problems, to monitor social media for any mentions of the Brennan family that might be damaging, to create positive content that would push down anything negative. Each piece of evidence built on the others to create a picture of systematic abuse and equally systematic efforts to conceal it. Margot herself testified again, walking through how she'd received the photograph and recordings, what she heard on them, how she'd verified their authenticity and decided to support Sowers publicly. Marcus Webb tried to paint her as estranged from the family and motivated by resentment, But Margot calmly explained that she'd had a good relationship with her father until she learned what he'd done, that she'd loved him and looked up to him, and that discovering his crimes had been devastating, precisely because she hadn't wanted to believe them. She said she'd verified every piece of evidence multiple times because she desperately hoped there was some other explanation. And only when she couldn't deny the truth anymore had she chosen to stand with the victims rather than the perpetrator. The defense case was shorter and focused primarily on attacking the credibility of the accusers and suggesting alternative explanations for the evidence. They called character witnesses who testified about Callum's reputation in the legal community, colleagues who said they'd never seen anything inappropriate, clients who praised his professionalism and integrity. They brought in their own psychologist who suggested that Sours's psychiatric conditions could cause false memories or distorted perceptions, though on cross-examination Imani got the expert to admit he'd never actually examined Sowers and was basing his opinions on selective readings of her medical records provided by the defense. Marcus Webb also tried to introduce evidence about Sours's past relationships and sexual history, arguing it was relevant to her credibility. But Judge Chun shut that down with a sharp rebuke about rape shield laws and the impropriety of victim-blaming tactics. The defense's strategy seemed increasingly desperate as the trial wore on, throwing everything at the wall to see what might create doubt. But the prosecution's case was simply too strong, too well documented, too consistent to be easily dismissed. Margot could see the jury's body language shifting as the trial progressed. Initial uncertainty giving way to what looked like conviction, and she allowed herself to hope that justice might actually happen. Callum himself chose not to testify, probably on Marcus Webb's advice, since his recorded voice was already extensively featured in the prosecution's evidence, and putting him on the stand would expose him to devastating cross-examination. His silence was strategic, but also telling, an acknowledgement that there was no good explanation for those recordings, no way to contextualize or justify what the jury had heard. The defense rested after just 4 days, unable to meaningfully counter the mountain of evidence against him, and closing arguments were scheduled for the following week. The weekend before closing arguments, Margot received an unexpected call from Deirdre, who said she needed to talk in person. They met at the same coffee shop where they'd had their first conversation about the abuse, and Deirdre looked terrible, exhausted and hollowed out in a way that made Margot's anger at her sister's abandonment soften slightly. Deirdre said she'd been following the trial coverage obsessively, that she couldn't sleep, that watching Sowers and the other women testify had broken something open in her that she'd spent 20 years keeping sealed. She said she'd been wrong to stay silent, wrong to prioritize her own comfort and safety over justice, wrong to let Margot and Sowers fight this battle alone. Margot asked if Deirdre was willing to testify about what their father had done to her, and her sister's face crumpled. She said the trial was almost over, that her testimony probably wouldn't even be allowed at this stage, but she wanted to give a statement to the media, to publicly acknowledge that she was also a victim and that she believed Sowers completely. Margot felt a rush of complicated emotions, gratitude that Deirdre was finally speaking up, mixed with resentment that it had taken this long. But she pushed the resentment aside and hugged her sister, told her that speaking up now still mattered, that it would make a difference, even if it didn't directly impact the verdict. They sat together for an hour, two sisters finally united in their truth, mourning the childhoods they'd lost, and the family that had never truly existed beneath the veneer of respectability. Deirdre held a press conference the next day, standing in front of cameras with Margot and Sowers flanking her, and publicly stated that she was also a survivor of their father's abuse. Her voice shook but didn't break as she described what he'd done to her when she was young, how she'd tried to tell their mother and been silenced, how she'd spent decades trying to pretend it hadn't happened while it poisoned every aspect of her life. She apologized to Sowers for not protecting her, for not speaking up sooner, for letting fear and shame keep her silent while her younger sister fought for justice alone. The press conference was covered extensively and seemed to shift some of the remaining public skepticism. This third daughter coming forward, removing any remaining doubt that this was a family conspiracy rather than genuine. Abuse, the prosecution's closing argument was delivered by Amani, and it brought together all the threads of evidence into a devastating tapestry of guilt. She walked the jury through the timeline again, showed them how every piece of evidence corroborated every other piece, reminded them of the courage it had taken for the victims to testify, and asked them to honor that courage with a just verdict. She addressed the defense's attempts to discredit the victims and pointed out that their credibility had been tested extensively through cross-examination and had held firm, that Marcus Webb's attacks were exactly the kind of victim blaming that allowed predators, like Margot Brennan, to operate with impunity for decades. She ended by asking the jury to send a message that no one was above the law, that power and position and professional reputation couldn't shield someone from accountability for crimes this serious and well-documented. Marcus Webb's closing argument was a last-ditch attempt to create reasonable doubt, suggesting that the prosecution's case was built on emotions rather than facts, that the jury couldn't convict someone based on decades-old allegations from people with clear biases against the defendant. He argued that the recordings could be explained as inappropriate, but not criminal conversations, that the victims' stories had inconsistencies that suggested coordination rather than genuine independent memories, that convicting Margot Brennan would set a dangerous precedent where anyone could be destroyed by accusations without solid proof. It was well argued but rang hollow after weeks of damning evidence. And Margot could see from the jurors' faces that they weren't buying it, that they'd made up their minds. The jury deliberated for 2 days, during which Margot barely slept or ate, just paced her apartment and checked her phone constantly and tried to prepare herself for either outcome. Sowers stayed with her and they talked through scenarios and possibilities, trying to steel themselves for the possibility of acquittal while not letting go of hope for conviction. When the call came that the jury had reached a verdict, they rushed to the courthouse along with the other victims and supporters, filing into the packed courtroom where their father sat looking smaller and grayer than ever, his expensive suit unable to restore the authority he'd once projected. The jury foreman was a middle-aged black man who had been taking careful notes throughout the trial. And when he stood to deliver the verdicts, his expression was solemn and certain. Judge Chen asked if the jury had reached unanimous verdicts on all counts, and he said they had. She instructed the defendant to rise, and Callum stood on shaking legs, Marcus Webb beside him looking grim. The foreman read the first verdict, on the count of sexual abuse of a minor in the first degree, guilty. Margot heard Sowers gasp beside her, felt her own vision blur with tears as the foreman continued. Guilty on count 2, guilty on count 3, guilty on all 18 counts, covering decades of abuse against multiple victims. The courtroom erupted in gasps and sobs, and one person cheered before being shushed by a bailiff. Margot grabbed Sowers' hand and they held on to each other while the verdicts were read, while their father stood frozen and their mother wailed from her seat on the defense side, while Marcus Webb requested immediate polling of the jury, which confirmed each member's agreement with the verdicts. Judge Chun set sentencing for 6 weeks out and ordered Callum remanded into custody. And as the bailiffs led him out of the courtroom, he looked back at his daughters. All 3 of them now, and Margot saw no remorse in his face. only shock that he'd actually been held accountable, that his power and position hadn't saved him. The media circus after the verdict was intense. Reporters shouting questions and cameras everywhere, and people wanting statements from everyone involved. Imani held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps with Sowers, Margot, Deirdre, and several other victims standing behind her, announcing that justice had been served and thanking the jury for their courage and attention to the evidence. Sowers gave a brief statement thanking everyone who'd supported her, saying that speaking her truth had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, but also the most liberating. That she hoped other survivors watching would know that coming forward was possible. That predators could be held accountable even when they seemed untouchable. The sentencing hearing 6 weeks later was equally emotional, with victim impact statements from Sowers and several other victims, describing how the abuse had affected every aspect of their lives. Sowers spoke directly to their father, saying she'd spent years hating herself for what he'd done to her, believing she was damaged and worthless and deserving of the pain he'd inflicted, but that through the process of seeking justice, she'd reclaimed her voice and her power and her fundamental belief in her own worth. She said she didn't forgive him and probably never would, but that she didn't need his remorse or acknowledgement to heal. That she was healing despite him rather than because of anything he did or didn't do now. Margot also gave a statement about the impact on the entire family, the way his crimes had poisoned every relationship and memory, how daughters who should have been protected had instead been violated and traumatized and forced to fight for basic acknowledgement of their suffering. She talked about the courage it had taken for the victims to come forward, knowing they'd be attacked and doubted, about the broken system that made seeking justice so difficult and re-traumatizing that most victims chose silence instead. She asked Judge Chun to impose the maximum sentence allowed by law, to send a clear message that these crimes were serious and would be punished accordingly regardless of the defendant's previous status or reputation. Judge Chen's sentencing statement was scathing, calling Talam's crimes a profound betrayal of the most fundamental duties of a parent and a breach of the trust placed in him as an officer of the court. She said the evidence showed systematic, calculated abuse over many years, that he'd used his knowledge of the legal system to evade accountability and intimidate his victims, that the psychological damage he'd inflicted was severe and lasting. She sentenced him to 25 years to life on the most serious charges, with additional sentences on the other counts to run concurrently, ensuring he'd spend the rest of his life in prison unless he somehow got parole in his mid-80s. As the sentence was pronounced, their father's composure finally broke and he started to weep. But whether from remorse or self-pity, Margot couldn't tell and didn't particularly care. The aftermath of the trial was complex and difficult in ways Margot hadn't fully anticipated. Victory mixed with grief and exhaustion and the slow realization that justice through the courts didn't magically heal trauma or repair damaged lives. Sowers was doing better than she had in years, finally free from the psychiatric facility and living independently with support from therapy and medication and a network of other survivors she'd connected with. Through the trial, she'd started playing piano again, tentatively at first and then with increasing confidence, rediscovering the talent that had been stolen from her and reclaiming music as something joyful rather than a reminder of what she'd lost. Margot struggled more than she'd expected with the emotional fallout. The grief for the father she'd thought she had, the anger at her mother's continued refusal to acknowledge the truth or support her daughters, the exhaustion from years of fighting, and the strange emptiness now that the fight was over. She went back to therapy herself, working through the complicated feelings about family and loyalty and the cost of doing the right thing when it meant destroying relationships that had defined her entire life. She also started receiving invitations to speak about her experience, to talk to law students and advocates and other survivors about navigating the legal system and supporting victims. And she found meaning in turning her pain into something useful for others. Deirdre had been transformed by finally speaking her truth, seemed lighter and more present than Margot had ever seen her. She told her husband and daughters about the abuse, had been met with support and love rather than the judgment and abandonment she'd feared, and was working with a therapist who specialized in trauma. She and Margot grew closer in the months after the trial, building a relationship as adults that they'd never had as children, finding ways to support each other through the ongoing healing process. She was also exploring legal options for holding their mother accountable for her role in enabling the abuse, though that would be a much harder case to make given how carefully Fianuala had avoided direct involvement. Their mother, Fianuala, maintained her public stance that Callum had been wrongly convicted, that her daughters were lying or delusional or motivated by greed, refusing to visit him in prison because she couldn't bear to see him imprisoned, but also apparently unable to fully accept his guilt. She became something of a figure in online communities that believed in father's rights and false accusations, giving interviews to friendly outlets about being the mother of accusers who destroyed a good man. Margot tried not to pay attention to it, tried to accept that her mother was lost to denial and would probably never acknowledge the truth. But it still hurt to see. Fianuala so committed to protecting Callum's memory even after everything. The legal proceedings weren't entirely over, because Marcus Webb immediately filed appeals on multiple grounds, arguing that the recordings should have been excluded as illegally obtained evidence, that the jury instructions were flawed, that media coverage had made a fair trial impossible. Legal experts said the appeals were unlikely to succeed, given how strong the evidence had been and how carefully Judge Chen had managed the trial. But the process would take years and meant that complete closure remained elusive. Margot found this frustrating but not surprising, knowing that their father would use every possible legal avenue to delay or avoid consequences, that his privilege extended even into his imprisonment. About a year after the verdict, Petra Kowalski published a book about the case that became a bestseller, a detailed account of the investigation and trial that brought renewed attention to the crimes and the broader issues around institutional protection of powerful predators. The book included interviews with Sowers, Margot, Deirdre, and several other victims, giving them control over their own narratives in a way the media coverage hadn't always allowed. A portion of the proceeds went to organizations supporting survivors of sexual abuse and to a legal fund helping other victims pursue justice against powerful abusers, turning the story into a resource for systemic change rather than just sensational true. The book's publication brought another wave of media attention and also prompted several more women to come forward with allegations about Callum. Women who'd been afraid to speak during the criminal trial but found courage in the verdict and the book. The district attorney was investigating whether additional charges could be filed for these newly disclosed crimes, though the legal complexities around charging someone already serving a life sentence were significant. Imani said it was still worth pursuing because official acknowledgement mattered to victims even when additional punishment was impossible, that the public record should reflect the full scope of his predatory behavior. Margot also learned that the Bar Association was pursuing disbarment proceedings against their father, a separate process from the criminal case that would formally strip him of his license to practice law. The proceedings were largely symbolic since he was imprisoned and would never practice again anyway, but the symbolism mattered. The official acknowledgement that he'd violated the most fundamental ethical obligations of the legal profession. She testified at the disbarment hearing about how he'd used his legal knowledge to cover up his crimes and intimidate witnesses. and the bar committee voted unanimously to disbar him and publish a detailed opinion about his misconduct that became required reading in legal ethics courses. 2 years after the conviction, Margot was invited to speak at Stanford Law School about her experience, and she stood in front of students who reminded her of herself at that age. Idealistic and ambitious, and believing the law was a tool for justice. She talked honestly about what she'd learned, that the legal system was designed to protect power more often than it challenged power, that getting justice required resources and privilege and luck that most victims didn't have. That Sours's case had only succeeded because they'd had recordings and multiple victims and a prosecutor willing to take on a powerful defendant despite the political risks. She said she still believed in the potential of law to serve justice, but that belief had to be tempered with clear-eyed recognition of its failures and limitations. That lawyers had an obligation to work toward systemic change, not just individual victories. The students asked hard questions about how she'd managed the personal cost of the case, whether she regretted testifying against her father, how she dealt with the family estrangement and professional damage. Margot answered honestly that some days she did regret it, that the cost had been higher than she'd anticipated, and there were moments when she wished she could go back to not knowing, to believing in the father who'd never really existed. But then she thought about Sowers reclaiming her life, about the other victims who'd been validated and believed, about the future young women who wouldn't encounter Callum Brennan because he was in prison where he belonged. And she knew she'd made the right choice, even if it wasn't an easy one. She also talked about how the experience had changed her understanding of justice, that she'd gone into law believing it was about rules and precedents and logical arguments, but fighting her father's case had taught her it was really about power and who got to wield it and who was willing to fight for accountability, even when the system made it nearly impossible. She said the most important thing law students could do was commit to using whatever power and privilege they accumulated in service of people who had less, to remember that access to justice shouldn't depend on having money or connections or the right demographics. That law was only a tool for justice if the people wielding it chose to make it one. After her talk, several students approached Margot privately to share their own stories of abuse or family secrets, looking for guidance or simply someone who would understand. She listened, each of them with the same attention and care she'd learned from Sowers, offering resources and validation and the hard-won wisdom that speaking truth was both costly and necessary. One young woman, barely 22, said that hearing Margot's story had given her the courage to finally report her uncle, that knowing someone had fought the system and won made it seem possible rather than futile. Margot hugged her and said that was exactly why the fight had been worth it, why she'd keep telling the story as long as people needed to hear it. On the drive back to her apartment that evening, Margot called Sowers to tell her about the talk, and her sister answered, sounding relaxed and happy in a way that still sometimes surprised Margot with its simple normalcy. Sowers was preparing for a small piano recital at a community center, her first public performance in over a decade, and she was nervous but excited rather than terrified. She said music felt different now, felt like something she was choosing rather than something being demanded of her, and that reclaiming it had been one of the most powerful parts of her healing. They talked for an hour about nothing important: Sours's plans for the recital, Margot's work on a new case, whether they should try to coordinate schedules for a weekend trip to the coast, and the ordinariness of it was its own kind of miracle. Margot thought about calling Deirdre too, but decided to text instead. Just a quick message saying the talk had gone well and asking how her sister's week was going. Deirdre responded almost immediately with a photo of her youngest daughter at a soccer game, followed by a message saying she'd been thinking about Margot Ann was proud of her for continuing to speak publicly about something so painful. The easy warmth of the exchange was still new enough to feel precious. This sisterhood they were building from the wreckage of their family. And Margot saved the photo and smiled at the image of her niece. Bright-eyed and laughing and safe in ways they'd never been. That night, alone in her apartment with a glass of wine and the lights of the city spread out below her window, Margot let herself feel the full weight and complexity of everything that had happened. The grief was still there, probably would always be there. Grief for the father she'd thought she had, and the childhood she'd believed in, and the family that had only ever existed in carefully constructed lies. But alongside the grief was something else now. Something harder and clearer and more permanent. The knowledge that she'd made choices that mattered. That she'd stood with victims instead of power. That when it counted most, she'd chosen truth over comfort and justice over loyalty. She thought about her father in prison, about whether he understood yet what he'd done, or if he'd die still believing himself the victim of a conspiracy. She thought about her mother, locked in her own prison of denial and bitterness, unable or unwilling to see her daughters as anything but betrayers. And she thought about Sowers preparing for her recital, about Deirdre building healthier relationships with her own children, about all the women who'd found their voices through this case. And she knew that some victories weren't clean or complete, but were still worth everything they cost. The legal system remained imperfect. The world still protected powerful men more often than it held them accountable. And the scars from her father's crimes would mark all of them for the rest of their lives. But tonight, Margot could look at her reflection in the dark window and recognize herself. Could see a woman who'd faced the hardest truth of her life and survived it. Who'd fought for justice even when it meant losing everything. Who'd learned that family was something you built with people who earned it rather than something you owed by. Accident of birth, she finished her wine and went to bed. And for the first time in 3 years, she slept deeply and dreamlessly. The envelope and the photograph and the recordings finally settled into history rather than haunting her present. Tomorrow she'd wake up and go back to work, back to fighting for other people's justice in a system that made it too hard and too rare. Back to being Margot Brennan, who'd taken down her own father and lived to tell about it. But tonight she simply rested, knowing that she and her sisters had done something possible, had spoken truth to power and won, and that nothing could ever take that victory away from them. In a facility in Northern California. Sowers sat at her piano and played through her recital pieces one more time. Her fingers strong and sure on the keys, her music no longer anyone's but her own. In Sacramento, Deirdre tucked her daughters into bed and kissed their foreheads and promised herself again that they would never know the silences she'd grown up in, that their childhood would be filled with truth and safety and the certainty of being believed. And in a prison cell 300 miles away, Callum Brennan lay awake in the dark. The weight of his crimes finally inescapable, his power finally gone, his daughters finally free. The envelope had arrived on a Tuesday and changed everything, just as Margot had known it would, but the change hadn't been destruction, it had been the painful, necessary work of building something true from the ruins of something false. And in the end, that was the only kind of family worth having, the only kind of justice worth fighting for, the only kind of story worth telling. The sisters had survived, had spoken, had won. And that would have to be enough because it was everything, because it was the truth. Because after all the years of silence and lies and carefully maintained facades, the truth was the only thing that could set any of them free.